The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Charleston, South Carolina, as Elias Hartman adjusted his silk top hat and straightened his expensive waistcoat. To anyone watching, he appeared to be exactly what he had spent the last 15 years becoming, a ruthless businessman, feared by competitors, despised by those who knew him, and notorious throughout Charleston for his cold heart and refusal to help anyone in need. But appearances, as Elias knew better than most, could be the greatest lies of all. At 45 years old, Elias possessed the kind of wealth that commanded respect and the kind of influence that opened doors throughout the Carolinas. His shipping company dominated Charleston's harbor. His cotton investments had made him a fortune, and his elegant mansion on East Bay Street was the envy of Charleston's elite. Yet beneath the carefully constructed facade of success lived a man who had forgotten who he truly was. Born Elijah Ben Abraham in a small Jewish community in Savannah, he had abandoned his heritage the day he realized that being Jewish in the American South meant being forever an outsider. When he married his beloved Catherine, a Christian woman from a prominent Charleston family, he had buried his past so completely that even his own prayers had become foreign to him. Now, 2 years after losing both Catherine and their precious daughter Hannah to the yellow fever epidemic that had ravaged Charleston, Elias wandered through life like a ghost, haunting his own existence. The mansion that had once echoed with laughter now stood silent, filled only with memories and the hollow sound of his footsteps on marble floors. On this particular morning in March of 1855, Elias found himself walking toward the Charleston slave market, not out of any desire to purchase human property, but because movement, any movement, was better than sitting alone with his grief. The auction block had become a grotesque form of entertainment for Charleston's wealthy, and Elias, in his numbness, had fallen into the habit of attending simply to have somewhere to go. The market square bustled with the usual crowd of plantation owners, overseers, and curious onlookers. The auctioneer, a crude man named Jameson with tobacco-stained teeth and a voice that carried across the square like a carnival barker, was already calling out descriptions of the day's merchandise. "Next lot," Jameson shouted, his voice cutting through the morning air. "3 young females, ages 12 to 16, recently acquired from a estate liquidation up in Virginia." Elias barely glanced up from his position near the back of the crowd, his mind lost in the familiar fog of grief and purposelessness. But then, something made him look toward the auction block, and what he saw stopped his heart cold. 3 young girls stood huddled together on the wooden platform, their arms wrapped around each other in desperate protection. They were clearly sisters. The resemblance was unmistakable in their dark hair, olive skin, and the intelligent brown eyes that darted fearfully across the crowd. But it wasn't their obvious terror that made Elias's breath catch in his throat. It was the small, barely visible symbol sewn into the oldest girl's torn dress, a tiny Star of David, so faded and small that only someone who knew what to look for would notice it. These were Jewish children. "Sarah, Rebecca, and Miriam Goldstein," the auctioneer continued, his voice dripping with the casual cruelty that had become second nature in his profession. "Orphaned when their parents died of some foreign disease up in Richmond. Good bloodlines, foreign stock but trainable. The oldest can read and write, unusual for her type but might be useful for household accounting." Elias felt something awakening inside him that he hadn't experienced in years, a burning rage that seemed to rise from the very depths of his soul. These children weren't just slaves being sold, they were his people, descendants of Abraham, daughters of Israel standing on an auction block like cattle. A portly man near the front of the crowd called out, "What kind of foreign stock, Jameson? They look like they might be troublemakers." "Jewish," Jameson replied with a dismissive wave, and several men in the crowd made sounds of disgust. "But don't worry, gentlemen, Jews make obedient workers once you break their stubborn streak, and these 3 have already been properly humbled by circumstances." "Jews," spat a thin man with a pointed beard. "Dirty money grubbers. Their kind killed our Lord Jesus Christ. I wouldn't have them on my property if you paid me." Another voice from the crowd. "Cursed people, the lot of them. But I suppose they might work in the fields if you keep them away from decent Christian folk." Elias watched in horror as the 3 sisters pressed closer together, the oldest girl, Sarah, wrapping her arms protectively around the 2 younger ones. Her face showed a maturity far beyond her 16 years, the kind of premature wisdom that comes only from unspeakable loss and suffering. "Bidding starts at $300 for the lot," Jameson announced. "These girls have good years of work ahead of them, and the youngest ones will grow into fine specimens. A few hands went up lazily around the crowd. Elias could see the calculations in the bidders' eyes. These men weren't seeing human beings. They were seeing property, investment, years of unpaid labor. The thought made him physically ill. "350, called out a rough-looking overseer from a rice plantation. 400, countered a woman in an elaborate bonnet who Elias recognized as the wife of a cotton broker. As the bidding continued, Elias found himself studying the three sisters more closely. The middle girl, Rebecca, kept whispering what sounded like prayers under her breath, her lips moving in patterns that Elias dimly recognized from his childhood. The youngest, Miriam, clung to Sarah's hand with the desperate grip of a child who had already lost everything once and knew it could happen again. But it was Sarah who broke his heart. Despite her obvious terror, she stood with a dignity that reminded Elias of his own grandmother, a woman who had faced pogroms in Eastern Europe, with the same quiet courage that seemed to run in Jewish blood, like an inheritance of pain and perseverance. 500, came another bid. 550. Elias felt his hand moving before his mind could catch up with his intentions. Something deep inside him, some connection to a heritage he had spent years denying, was compelling him forward. $1,000, he called out clearly, his voice carrying the authority of serious wealth. The crowd turned to look at him in surprise. $1,000 was an enormous sum for three young slaves, far more than their estimated value for labor. "Mr. Hartman," Jameson called out with obvious delight. $1,000. Do I hear 1,100? The other bidders hesitated. Everyone in Charleston knew that when Elias Hartman bid on something, he usually got it. His wealth was legendary, and few people were willing to engage in a bidding war with him. "Going once," Jameson called. "Going twice." Elias looked up at the three sisters and saw Sarah staring directly at him. For just a moment, their eyes met across the crowded square, and he saw something there that made his heart ache. Not just fear, but a desperate hope, mixed with the terrible knowledge that hope had betrayed her before. "Sold!" Jameson's gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo through Elias's soul. 3 Jewish girls to Mr. Elias Hartman for $1,000. As the crowd began to disperse and other lots were brought forward, Elias made his way toward the payment area, his legs feeling strangely weak. What had he just done? What was he going to do with 3 traumatized Jewish children? He had acted on pure instinct, driven by something he couldn't name or understand. Behind him, he could hear whispered conversations. Wonder what that heartless Hartman wants with those Jewish girls. Probably put them to work in harsh conditions. Man's got no mercy in him. Strange choice for someone who's never shown kindness to anyone. Those poor children don't know what they're in for. Hartman's probably the worst master they could have ended up with. That man's got ice water in his veins. As Elias signed the papers and handed over the payment, he found himself wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, or if perhaps he had finally done something that his long-buried soul could approve of. When he turned to collect his property, he saw the 3 sisters standing together at the edge of the platform, their few belongings clutched in their hands, their eyes wide with terror and uncertainty. They had no idea what fate awaited them, no way of knowing whether this well-dressed stranger would be their salvation or their destruction. And in that moment, looking at their faces, Elias Hartman began to remember something he had forgotten long ago, that sometimes God works through the most unexpected vessels to fulfill his purposes of mercy. If this story is stirring something deep in your soul, please subscribe to our channel, because sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen when we choose compassion over convenience. And you never know when a single moment of decision might change everything. In the darkest moments of history, God often disguises his angels as ordinary people, making extraordinary choices. The carriage ride through Charleston's tree-lined streets felt like an eternity to the 3 sisters, huddled together on the worn leather seat. Sarah kept her arms wrapped protectively around Rebecca and Miriam, whispering gentle reassurances in Yiddish that she didn't truly believe herself. The man who had purchased them, this Elias Hartman, sat across from them in complete silence, his cold grey eyes occasionally glancing in their direction with an expression they couldn't read. "Soll sein still, meine Taya," Sarah whispered to her younger sisters. "Be quiet, my dear ones, we must be strong." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah's heart hammered with terror. She had heard the whispered conversations at the auction, had seen the way people's faces changed when Hartman's name was mentioned. Stories of his cruelty were legendary throughout Virginia and the Carolinas. A man who foreclosed on widows without mercy, who threw families into the street during winter, who had never shown compassion to any living soul. Rebecca, at 14, pressed closer to Sarah's side, her lips moving in silent prayer. Since their parents' death 3 months ago, Rebecca had found solace only in the ancient words their mother had taught them, the prayers that connected them to something larger than their suffering. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, she breathed so quietly that only Sarah could hear. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. 12-year-old Miriam trembled like a leaf in autumn wind, her small hand clutching the torn corner of Sarah's dress. She had not spoken since the day they were taken from their parents' graves and sold to pay imaginary debts. The trauma had stolen her voice, leaving behind only the wide, frightened eyes that seemed to hold all the world's pain. Elias watched the 3 sisters from behind hooded eyes, something stirring in his chest that he refused to acknowledge. Their whispered prayers in a language he understood but pretended not to know made his jaw clench with an emotion he couldn't name. He forced himself to look away, staring out the carriage window at the familiar streets of his adopted city. The carriage turned onto East Bay Street, and the Hartman mansion came into view. 3 stories of imposing brick and marble, with iron gates and perfectly manicured gardens, it stood like a fortress against the world. To the sisters, it looked like a prison where their worst nightmares would come true. As the carriage stopped, Elias stepped out first and turned to help them down. Sarah hesitated, then took his offered hand with obvious reluctance, helping her sisters to the ground. They stood together on the cobblestone driveway, 3 small figures dwarfed by the mansion's imposing facade, looking like sparrows caught in a storm. "Follow me," Elias said simply, his voice carrying none of the warmth the sisters desperately needed to hear. They walked through the front entrance into a foyer that took their breath away. Marble floors polished to mirror brightness, crystal chandeliers that sparkled like captured starlight, paintings in golden frames that cost more than most families saw in a lifetime. But the grandeur felt cold, empty, like a beautiful mausoleum where joy had died long ago. The click of their footsteps echoed through hallways lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch their passage with disapproving eyes. Servants moved silently through the shadows, their faces carefully blank, offering no comfort or acknowledgement to the 3 newcomers. Elias led them up a grand staircase to the 2nd floor, stopping before a heavy oak door. He opened it to reveal a spacious room with 3 beds, clean linens, and a window overlooking the garden. By Charleston standards, it was luxurious. By the standards of what the sisters had expected, it was incomprehensible. "This is where you will stay," Elias said curtly. The sisters remained frozen in the doorway, afraid to enter, afraid to trust what their eyes were telling them. "I don't understand," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from us?" Elias turned to face them, his expression unreadable. "Nothing." "Nothing?" Rebecca spoke for the first time since entering the house, her voice filled with disbelief. "Men like you don't spend $1,000 for nothing." Something flickered across Elias's face. Pain, perhaps, or recognition of a truth he didn't want to acknowledge. "Men like me," he repeated slowly. "And what kind of man do you think I am?" Sarah lifted her chin with a courage that belied her fear. "A cruel man. A man without mercy. Everyone in Charleston knows your reputation, Mr. Hartman. You foreclose on widows. You evict families in winter. You have never shown kindness to anyone." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "So forgive us if we don't understand why you would buy 3 Jewish orphans, unless you meant to... She couldn't finish the sentence, but the implications hung heavy in the air. Elias stared at her for a long moment, something working behind his steel-gray eyes. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "You are not prisoners here. The door has no lock from the outside. There are clean clothes in the wardrobe. Food will be brought to you, and tomorrow..." He paused, as if struggling with words he'd never spoken before. "Tomorrow, we will discuss your situation further." "Our situation?" Sarah pressed. "What situation? We are slaves. You bought us. What is there to discuss?" "Perhaps," Elias said carefully, "things are not always as they appear." With that cryptic statement, he turned and walked toward the door. But Sarah's voice stopped him. "Mr. Hartman," she called out, desperation creeping into her tone. Please, we have lost everything, our parents, our home, our freedom. If you mean to harm us, at least tell us what you intend. This kindness, it frightens us more than cruelty would. Elias paused at the threshold, his hand on the doorframe. For a moment his shoulders seemed to sag under some invisible weight. I intend, he said without turning around, to remember something I thought I had forgotten forever. And with that he was gone, leaving the three sisters alone with their fears and their prayers, and the terrible uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. As soon as the door closed, the sisters rushed together, holding each other tight. What do you think he meant? Rebecca whispered. Sarah shook her head, her mind racing. I don't know, but we must be careful. Men like Hartman don't change overnight. There's something he's not telling us. Young Miriam pressed her face against Sarah's shoulder, still silent, but tears streaming down her cheeks. The older sisters held her close, whispering the ancient prayers their mother had taught them, drawing strength from words that had sustained their people through centuries of persecution. Adonai li, v'lo ira, Rebecca whispered. The Lord is with me. I will not fear. But fear was all they had left, and as night fell over Charleston, 3 Jewish orphans lay awake in a stranger's house, wondering if they had been saved or if their real suffering was only beginning. Outside their door, Elias Hartman stood in the shadows of the hallway, listening to their whispered prayers and feeling something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 15 long years. What do you think Elias really intends? Can a man known for his cruelty truly change, or are the sisters right to fear his hidden motives? Share your thoughts below. Dawn broke over Charleston with the gentle warmth of spring, but inside the Hartman mansion, 3 sisters huddled together on one bed, having barely slept through the night. Every creak of the old house, every footstep in the hallway, had sent their hearts racing with fear of what morning might bring. Sarah had spent most of the night watching the door, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers. Why had this cruel man bought them? What did he truly want? And why did something in his eyes seem familiar, almost protective? A soft knock at the door made all 3 girls freeze. Come in, Sarah called out, her voice steadier than she felt. The door opened to reveal not Elias, but an elderly black woman carrying a silver tray. She was well dressed for a servant, with kind eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had seen much suffering in her lifetime. Good morning, children, she said gently. I'm Martha. I've brought you breakfast. She set the tray on a small table by the window, and the aroma that filled the room made the sisters gasp in surprise. Fresh challah bread, still warm from the oven, smoked fish, hard-boiled eggs, foods that spoke of traditions, of Sabbath mornings, of home. How? Rebecca began, then stopped herself. Martha smiled knowingly. Mr. Hartman was very specific about what you would need, said you had particular dietary requirements. Sarah stared at the food, her mind racing. How could Elias possibly know about kosher food? Why would a man with his reputation care about Jewish dietary laws? The questions multiplied like shadows at sunset. Where is Mr. Hartman? Sarah asked carefully. In his study, working, Martha replied. He asked me to tell you that when you're ready, he'd like to speak with you. But there's no hurry, child. Eat first. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in months. After Martha left, the sisters stared at the food in wonder and confusion. This is kosher, Miriam whispered, the first words she had spoken since their parents' death. The sight of familiar foods had somehow unlocked her voice, if only briefly. But how does he know? Rebecca asked, voicing what they were all thinking. Christians don't know about keeping kosher. Most of them think our dietary laws are strange superstitions. Sarah picked up a piece of the challah, feeling its familiar texture between her fingers. There's something he's not telling us, something important. They ate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The food was perfectly prepared, exactly as their mother used to make it. Either Elias had employed a Jewish cook, unlikely in Charleston, or he knew far more about their traditions than he was letting on. An hour later, they made their way downstairs to find Elias. The mansion looked different in daylight, still imposing, but less frightening. Sunlight streamed through tall windows and they could hear birds singing in the garden. They found him in his library, a massive room lined floor to ceiling with books. He stood with his back to them, studying a leather-bound volume. When he heard their footsteps, he turned, and Sarah noticed something she had missed the day before, exhaustion in his eyes, as if he hadn't slept any better than they had. "Did you eat well?" he asked, closing the book and setting it aside. "Yes," Sarah replied carefully. "The food was exactly what we needed." "How did you know?" Something flickered across Elias's face, surprise perhaps that he had revealed more than he intended. "I have experience with different dietary requirements." It was a vague answer, and Sarah wasn't satisfied. "What kind of experience?" Elias hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Sarah saw something that made her heart skip. He looked exactly like her father had when he was trying to decide how much truth to tell. "Business," Elias said finally. "I've dealt with merchants from many different backgrounds." But Sarah was no longer listening to his words. She was studying his face, his gestures, the way he held himself, and suddenly fragments began falling into place like pieces of a puzzle. "Mr. Hartman," she said slowly, "yesterday you seemed to understand when Rebecca prayed in Hebrew. Most people would have asked what language she was speaking." Elias's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I've traveled widely. I pick up fragments of many languages. And the kosher food, you knew exactly what we would need down to the smallest details. As I said, business experience." Sarah took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his face. "And when you bought us at the auction, you looked angry. Not the calculating anger of a man making a business decision, but the righteous anger of someone who saw his own people being degraded." "You're imagining things," Elias said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Am I?" Sarah challenged. "Then explain this." She moved to his desk, where the book he had been reading lay open. The text was in Hebrew, ancient commentaries on the Torah that only a scholar would possess, let alone understand. Elias moved quickly to close the book, but it was too late. Sarah had seen enough. "Rashi's commentary on Bereshit," she said quietly. "My father had the same volume. He used to read from it every morning before prayers." The silence that followed was profound. Rebecca and Miriam exchanged glances, sensing the importance of the moment, even if they didn't fully understand it. "You're Jewish," Sarah said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "You're one of us." Elias stood frozen, his hand still on the closed book, his face a mask of conflict. For 15 years he had hidden this truth, buried it so deep that even he sometimes forgot. But standing here, facing this brave girl who had lost everything and still held onto her faith, he felt the walls he had built around his identity beginning to crumble. "I don't know what you mean," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Sarah stepped closer, and when she spoke her voice was gentle but insistent. "My grandfather used to say that you can take a Jew out of the synagogue, but you can never take the synagogue out of the Jew. He said our souls carry the memory of every prayer our ancestors ever spoke." She paused, studying his face with eyes that seemed far older than her 16 years. "What were you reading just now? What passage?" Elias looked down at the book, then back at her. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. "And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son." "The binding of Isaac," Sarah breathed. "Why that passage?" For a moment, Elias's carefully constructed facade cracked, and she saw pain so deep it made her heart ache. "Because," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I have been wondering if God provides rams for all his children, or only for the sons of Abraham who remain faithful to their calling." The admission hung in the air between them, like a bridge partially built, enough to suggest connection but not enough to cross safely. Rebecca moved closer to Sarah, her eyes wide with understanding. "You've been hiding," she whispered. "You've been pretending not to be Jewish." Elias straightened, his mask sliding back into place. "I think you're confusing gratitude with fantasy. I bought you to save you from a worse fate. That doesn't make me anything other than what I am." "And what are you?" Sarah asked pointedly. "A businessman who made a business decision. A businessman who reads Hebrew commentaries on the Torah. A businessman who collects rare books. A businessman who knows exactly how to prepare kosher food. A businessman who pays attention to details." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, then did something that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She smiled. "You know what my mother used to say about men who answered every question with another evasion?" "What?" "She said they were usually hiding something worth finding." Elias felt something twist in his chest at the mention of her mother, at the casual way Sarah spoke of the woman whose death had led to her own enslavement. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." he said quietly. She was, Sarah replied. And she taught me that sometimes the greatest kindness is helping someone remember who they really are, even when they've forgotten themselves. The words hit Elias like a physical blow. Here was this child, this orphaned girl who had every reason to hate the world, offering him something he hadn't dared hope for in years, the possibility of redemption, of return, of remembering. But 15 years of carefully constructed barriers don't fall in a single conversation. Elias turned away from them, moving to the window that overlooked his garden. "You should rest," he said, his voice deliberately distant. "Tomorrow I'll arrange for a tutor. If you're going to stay here, you'll need proper education." It was a dismissal, and they all knew it. But as the sisters filed toward the door, Sarah paused. "Mr. Hartman," she said softly, "my father used to say that God never gives up on his children, even when they give up on themselves. Especially then." She left him standing alone in his library, surrounded by books that spoke of a heritage he had abandoned and a faith he had forgotten how to claim. But for the first time in 15 years, Elias Hartman, or perhaps it was Elijah ben Abraham, began to wonder if it might be possible to come home again. Do you think Sarah is right to push him toward the truth? Sometimes the greatest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. What do you think it would take for someone to reclaim an identity they've spent years hiding? Share your thoughts below. Friday evening approached Charleston with the golden promise of Sabbath, though within the Hartman mansion, only 3 young souls recognized the sacred rhythm of the approaching holy day. For 2 days since their confrontation in the library, Elias had avoided the sisters, taking his meals alone and retreating to his study like a wounded animal seeking solitude. But Sarah had not been idle. With the quiet determination that had helped her survive months of unspeakable loss, she had been planning something that would force the truth into the light once and for all. "Are you certain about this?" Rebecca whispered as the 3 sisters worked quietly in the dining room. They had convinced Martha to let them arrange flowers for the evening, but their true purpose was far more significant. "If I'm wrong," Sarah replied, carefully placing 2 silver candlesticks on the mahogany table, "then we'll know for certain that he's simply a kind stranger who saved us. But if I'm right..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood what was at stake. Miriam, who had been speaking more each day since tasting the familiar kosher food, held the challah bread they had somehow convinced Martha to bake. "Mama used to say that the Sabbath light could awaken even the most sleeping soul," she whispered. Sarah nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she positioned the ritual objects with precision born from years of helping her mother prepare for Sabbath. The white tablecloth, the wine cup filled with grape juice, the covered challah, and finally the unlit candles that waited like silent prayers for the blessing that would welcome the holy day. "If he is truly one of us," Sarah said, stepping back to survey their work, "his soul will remember even if his mind has forgotten." As the sun began to set over Charleston, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the sisters hid themselves in the adjacent parlor, leaving the dining room door slightly ajar so they could observe what would happen when Elias discovered what they had done. They didn't have to wait long. Elias emerged from his study, as was his custom for the evening meal, his footsteps echoing through the marble halls. But when he reached the dining room, his footsteps stopped abruptly. From their hiding place, the sisters watched as he stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the Sabbath table as if seeing a ghost from his past. His face went pale, and his hand gripped the doorframe so tightly that his knuckles turned white. For a long moment, he simply stood there, and the sisters began to fear that they had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps he would be angry. Perhaps this would destroy whatever fragile trust they had begun to build. But then something extraordinary happened. Elias took a tentative step into the room, then another, drawn toward the table like a man walking through a dream. When he reached the candlesticks, he stopped, his eyes fixed on the unlit wicks as if they held the secrets of the universe. "Baruch atah Adonai," he began in a whisper so soft the sisters had to strain to hear it. "Eloheinu melech ha'olam." The ancient Hebrew words flowed from his lips, with the muscle memory of 1,000 Friday evenings, the blessing for lighting Sabbath candles that his grandmother had taught him when he was barely old enough to speak. But as he reached for the matches, his hand began to shake violently. "I can't," he said to the empty room, his voice breaking. "I don't deserve to light them. I don't deserve to speak his name." It was then that Sarah stepped out of hiding, moving quietly into the room like an angel of mercy approaching a broken soul. "My father used to say," she said gently, "that the Sabbath lights don't burn for the righteous alone. They burn for all of Abraham's children, especially those who have lost their way." Elias spun around, startled by her presence, his face a mixture of anguish and embarrassment at being caught in such a vulnerable moment. "Ah, you did this," he said, and his voice held no anger, only wonder. "We did this," Sarah replied, as Rebecca and Miriam joined her in the room, "because we recognized something in you that you've forgotten how to see in yourself." Elias stared at the three sisters, these children who had lost everything, yet somehow found the strength to offer him back his own heritage. "You don't understand," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I abandoned it all. When Catherine died, when my daughter Hannah was taken from me, I blamed God. I blamed my faith. I decided that if being Jewish meant suffering, then I would simply stop being Jewish." He turned back to the table, his eyes fixed on the waiting candles. "For 15 years I've lived as someone else. I've made myself into exactly the kind of man our people have always feared, cold, cruel, without mercy. I've foreclosed on families, destroyed lives, shown no compassion to anyone." His voice dropped to a whisper. "How can someone like me dare to welcome the Sabbath?" Sarah moved closer, her young heart breaking for this man who carried such a burden of self-hatred. "My grandfather survived the pogroms in Poland," she said softly. "He watched his parents murdered by Cossacks, saw his synagogue burned, lost everything he had ever loved. When he came to America, he was so angry at God that he didn't speak to him for 2 years." Elias looked at her, surprised by the parallel in their stories. "What changed?" he asked. "A little girl," Sarah replied with a gentle smile. "My mother. She was 3 years old, and one Friday evening she climbed onto his lap and asked why they never lit candles like her friend's family did. My grandfather realized that in his anger at God, he was punishing not just himself, but an innocent child who deserved to know the beauty of her heritage." She paused, looking directly into Elias's eyes. "He told me that night he understood something important. God doesn't abandon us when we suffer. We abandon God when we let suffering make us forget who we're meant to be." Elias felt tears beginning to form in his eyes, tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in 15 years. "I don't know how to come back," he whispered. "I've forgotten so much. The prayers, the traditions, the meaning of it all." Rebecca stepped forward, her young voice filled with surprising wisdom. "Our mother used to say that forgetting is not the same as losing. The words, the melodies, the love, they're all still inside you, waiting for permission to return." Miriam, the youngest, approached the table and picked up the box of matches. With hands steadier than anyone would have expected from a 12-year-old who had survived such trauma, she lit one match and held it out to Elias. "Would you like me to help you remember?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. Elias stared at the small flame, seeing in it not just fire, but possibility. The possibility of return, of redemption, of reclaiming an identity he had thought lost forever. With shaking hands, he took the match from Miriam and held it to the first candle. As the wick caught fire, something inside him that had been frozen for 15 years began to thaw. "Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech ha'olam," he began, and this time his voice was stronger. "Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Shabbat." "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to kindle the Sabbath light." As he lit the second candle, the dining room filled with a warm golden glow that seemed to emanate not just from the flames, but from something deeper, the light of recognition, of homecoming, of a soul remembering its true name. When the blessing was complete, Elias stood staring at the burning candles, tears streaming down his face. "My name," he said quietly, "my real name is Elijah ben Abraham. I was born in Savannah to parents who gave up everything so their children could be free. And for 15 years I dishonored their memory by pretending they never existed." Sarah reached out and gently touched his arm. "Then tonight, you begin to honor them again." For the first time since his wife's death, Elijah, no longer Elias, but Elijah, felt something he had forgotten existed. Hope. Hope that it wasn't too late. Hope that these 3 remarkable children, these daughters of Israel who had somehow maintained their faith through unimaginable loss, could teach him how to find his way home. "Will you," he began, then stopped, overcome by emotion. "Will we what?" Sarah asked gently. Will you teach me? Will you help me remember how to be what I was born to be? The three sisters exchanged glances, and in that moment, a new family was born. Not of blood, but of something stronger. Shared faith, mutual healing, and the unbreakable bonds that form when broken souls choose to mend together. Yes, Sarah said simply, we'll teach you everything our parents taught us, and together we'll learn what it means to come home. As the Sabbath candles burned in the grand dining room of the Hartman mansion, 4 Jewish souls sat down to break bread together, beginning a journey that would transform not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others who would benefit from their rediscovered faith in the power of compassion, community, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Have you ever had to rediscover a part of yourself that you thought was lost forever? Sometimes our greatest teachers come in the most unexpected forms. What do you think these children can teach a grown man about faith and identity? Share your thoughts below. 3 months had passed since that transformative Friday evening when Sabbath light returned to the Hartman mansion, and the change in both the house and its inhabitants was nothing short of miraculous. Where once cold marble halls had echoed with loneliness, now there was warmth, laughter, and the gentle murmur of Hebrew prayers that flowed like music through rooms that had forgotten how to sing. Elijah, for he now insisted on his true name, stood in his study each morning at dawn, wrapped in the tallit his father had given him decades ago, carefully preserved in a cedar chest he hadn't opened in 15 years. Sarah had found it while helping him search for other remnants of his abandoned faith, and when she placed the prayer shawl in his hands, he had wept like a child. Modeh ani lifanecha, he whispered now, as he did every morning, reciting the ancient prayer of gratitude for waking to see another day. I offer thanks to you, living and eternal King, for you have mercifully restored my soul within me. Your faithfulness is great. The words had special meaning for him now. God had indeed restored his soul, through the unlikely ministry of 3 orphaned children who had refused to let him remain lost. In the weeks that followed their Sabbath revelation, the sisters had become his teachers with a patience and wisdom that humbled him daily. Rebecca, with her gift for memorization, helped him relearn the prayers he had abandoned. Young Miriam, whose voice grew stronger each day, sang the ancient melodies their mother had taught them, awakening musical memories Elijah thought were lost forever. But it was Sarah who proved to be his most profound teacher. At 16, she possessed an understanding of Jewish law and tradition that rivaled many scholars twice her age. More than that, she understood the heart behind the law, the reason for each commandment, the love that motivated every restriction, the joy that waited beyond every sacrifice. Why do we cover our heads when we pray? She had asked him one morning, not because she didn't know, but because she wanted him to rediscover the answer for himself. To remind us, Elijah had replied slowly, that there is always something above us, that we are not the highest power in the universe. And why do we give tzedakah, charity? Because justice and compassion are not optional for the children of Abraham. They are the very essence of who we are called to be. As his understanding deepened, so did his transformation. The cruel businessman who had once foreclosed on widows became a secret benefactor to struggling families throughout Charleston. The man who had shown no mercy began quietly paying off debts, preventing evictions, and ensuring that no one in his sphere of influence would suffer the kind of financial destruction he had once inflicted without thought. But his most important work remained hidden from the general population of Charleston. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the Carolina sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elijah stood at his window watching 3 carriages approach his mansion under cover of pre-dawn darkness. He had been expecting them, though the sight still made his heart race with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. They're here, Sarah said softly, appearing beside him at the window. She had developed an uncanny ability to sense important moments, as if her young life had taught her to recognize the sound of destiny approaching. 12 people, Elijah murmured, counting the shadows emerging from the carriages, including 4 children. All of them Jewish, all of them fleeing persecution in Virginia. A synagogue was burned in Richmond last week. These families lost everything. Sarah studied his profile in the dim light. And you're going to help them. It wasn't a question. In the months since his return to faith, Elijah had quietly become something Charleston had never seen, a Jewish man with the resources and courage to create an underground network of protection for his persecuted people. Using his shipping connections, his financial resources, and his knowledge of Southern society, he had begun moving threatened families to safety in the north. "We're going to help them," he corrected gently. "This house, this sanctuary we've created together, it belongs to all of us now." As the refugees approached the front door, Elijah and the sisters hurried downstairs to greet them. Martha, who had initially been suspicious of the changes in her employer, had become one of their most devoted allies once she understood what they were doing. She had already prepared rooms, heated water for baths, and arranged for kosher meals that would comfort souls as well as bodies. The group that entered the mansion was heartbreaking in their exhaustion and fear, yet beautiful in their determination to survive. An elderly rabbi with a white beard stained by smoke from his burned synagogue, a young mother clutching two small children who hadn't spoken since watching their father beaten by a mob, a teenage boy whose eyes held the premature wisdom of someone who had seen too much hatred too young. "Shalom Aleichem," Elijah said softly as they gathered in his foyer. "Peace be upon you. You are safe here." "Aleichem shalom," the rabbi replied, tears streaming down his weathered face. "And upon you peace. We heard there was a Jewish family in Charleston who might help us, but we were told it was a wealthy man who had abandoned his faith. We weren't sure." "You were told correctly," Elijah replied with a humility that still surprised the sisters. "I did abandon my faith, but these three remarkable young women helped me remember that our God specializes in bringing the lost home again." As Martha and the sisters helped settle the refugees into prepared rooms, Elijah found himself alone with the rabbi in his study. The old man's eyes took in the Hebrew books, the mezuzah that now graced the doorpost, the small but growing collection of ritual objects that spoke of a faith being carefully rebuilt. "How long?" the rabbi asked simply. "Since I returned. 3 months. Since I abandoned the path." Elijah's voice grew heavy. 15 years. The rabbi nodded with the understanding of someone who had counseled many struggling souls. "And what brought you back?" Elijah gestured toward the sounds of gentle conversation drifting from upstairs, where the sisters were helping the refugee families settle in. 3 orphaned children who somehow maintained their faith through losses that would have destroyed most adults. "They taught me that we don't serve God because life is easy, but because serving God gives meaning to life's difficulties." "Ah," the rabbi said with a knowing smile, "sometimes the youngest among us become our greatest teachers." "Rabbi," Elijah said, leaning forward in his chair, "I want to do more. I have resources, connections, influence. If there are more families like yours who need help—" "There are," the rabbi replied soberly, "more than you can imagine. The hatred is spreading, Mr. Elijah ben Abraham. The hatred is spreading, Elijah ben Abraham. Synagogues are being burned, businesses destroyed, families driven from their homes. What you're doing here, creating sanctuary, building a network of protection, it could save many lives." "Then that's what we'll do," Elijah said with quiet determination. "This house will be a place of refuge for as long as it's needed." Over the following days, the mansion transformed into something unprecedented in Charleston, a functioning Jewish household that served as both home and sanctuary. The morning prayers now included a minyan, the 10 adult males required for certain prayers, as refugee men joined Elijah in the ancient ritual of calling upon their Creator. Sarah took charge of teaching the refugee children, creating an informal school in the mansion's library where Hebrew lessons mixed with regular education. Rebecca organized the women, helping them process their trauma while maintaining the domestic rhythms that brought comfort and normalcy. Young Miriam, whose own voice had been restored through love and patience, worked special magic with the children who had been traumatized into silence. But it was the Friday evening Sabbath services that truly revealed the miracle taking place within the Hartman mansion walls. What had begun as 4 souls sharing bread in a grand dining room had become a congregation of 23 people, gathering to welcome the holy day with songs, prayers, and the kind of joy that only those who have nearly lost everything can fully appreciate. "Shabbat Shalom," Elijah said, as he lifted the Kiddush cup for the blessing over wine, his voice carrying across a table now expanded to accommodate their growing family. "Shabbat Shalom," came the response from voices young and old, broken and healing, grateful beyond words for this sanctuary of faith in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything they held sacred. As candles flickered and wine was shared and challah was broken, Elijah looked around the table at faces that represented not just individual lives saved, but the preservation of something precious and eternal. These were not just refugees he was sheltering. They were links in an unbroken chain of faith stretching back to Abraham himself. Later that evening, as the house settled into the peaceful rhythm of Sabbath rest, Sarah found Elijah standing alone on the mansion's front porch, looking out at the gaslit streets of Charleston. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "About my father," he replied. "About what he would think of what we've done here." "What do you think he would say?" Elijah smiled, and in that smile Sarah saw not the bitter businessman who had bought them at auction, but the gentle soul he had always been meant to be. "I think he would say that sometimes we have to lose ourselves completely before we can find out who we really are, and that the greatest treasure isn't what we accumulate, but what we give away." As if summoned by their conversation, Rebecca and Miriam joined them on the porch, and the four of them stood together in comfortable silence, listening to the distant sounds of a city that had no idea it harbored one of the most important sanctuaries in the American South. "What happens next?" Miriam asked, her young voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned that life could change in an instant. "Next," Elijah said, placing protective arms around all three sisters, "we continue to build. We continue to serve. We continue to prove that love is stronger than hatred, and that home isn't a place you find. It's a place you create, one heart at a time. Do you believe that people can truly change, or do we simply become more of who we always were inside? What would you do if you had the resources to create sanctuary for those who desperately needed it? Share your thoughts below. April 1861 brought more than spring flowers to Charleston. It brought the thunder of cannons across Charleston Harbor as Confederate forces fired upon Fort Sumter, and with those first shots, the fragile sanctuary that Elijah and the sisters had built suddenly found itself in mortal danger. The war that everyone had whispered about in drawing rooms and predicted in newspapers had finally arrived, and with it came a surge of Confederate nationalism that viewed anyone different, anyone foreign, anyone who didn't fit the narrow definition of Southern loyalty as a potential enemy. Sarah, now 17 and possessed of a maturity that made her seem far older, stood beside Elijah in his study as they read the morning Charleston Mercury together. The headlines screamed of glorious Confederate victories, but buried deeper in the paper were smaller stories that made their blood run cold. Foreign agitators suspected of Union sympathies, vigilance committees formed to root out traitors, Jewish merchants under investigation for disloyalty. "They're coming for us," Sarah said quietly, her finger tracing a particularly ominous paragraph about foreign elements that might be undermining the Confederate cause. Elijah nodded grimly. In the year since they had begun their underground work, their network had grown to help over 200 Jewish refugees escape to safety in the north. But success had brought visibility, and visibility in wartime Charleston meant danger. "Mrs. Patterson from down the street asked Martha yesterday why we have so many visitors coming and going at odd hours," Sarah continued, "and I've noticed men watching the house from the park across the street." "I've seen them too," Elijah replied. "Confederate intelligence, most likely, or local vigilantes who've appointed themselves guardians of Southern purity." As if summoned by their conversation, Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her face pale with worry. "Elijah, there's a problem. Rabbi Goldberg received word this morning. There's a family hiding in the docks, parents and 3 children. They escaped from a mob in Columbia, but they're trapped. The regular routes north are being watched." Elijah felt the familiar weight of impossible decisions settling on his shoulders. Every rescue operation now carried exponentially greater risk, not just for him and the sisters, but for the 24 refugees currently sheltering in his mansion. "How many people are we hiding now?" he asked, though he knew the answer. 26, Sarah replied immediately. "Including the baby that was born last week to the Rosenberg family, 26 Jewish souls depending on his protection in a city that was rapidly becoming hostile to anyone who didn't enthusiastically embrace the Confederate cause." Elijah moved to his window and looked out at the garden where several of the refugee children were playing, their laughter a defiant sound of joy in increasingly dark times. "We can't abandon the family at the docks," he said finally, "but we also can't risk everyone here by continuing to operate as we have been." "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked, recognizing the tone in his voice that meant he was formulating a plan. "Dispersion," Elijah replied. "We've been thinking of this house as a permanent sanctuary, but maybe that was naive. Maybe the real sanctuary is the network itself, the ability to move people to safety, not to keep them in one place indefinitely." Over the next several hours, Elijah, Sarah, and the other adults in their expanded household worked frantically to create a new strategy. Using his shipping connections and remaining financial resources, Elijah arranged for a cargo vessel to make an unscheduled stop at Charleston's harbor. Under cover of darkness, they would move their refugees in small groups to the ship, which would carry them to safety in Philadelphia. But even as they planned, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. "Mr. Hartman," Martha said, appearing in the study with an expression of barely controlled panic, "there are soldiers at the front gate, Confederate soldiers asking questions about our guests." Through the window, Elijah could see a small patrol of gray-uniformed men speaking with his groundskeeper. Their body language was casual for now, but he recognized the careful way they positioned themselves. These were men prepared for trouble. "Sarah," he said quietly, "go upstairs and tell everyone to prepare for immediate departure. Use the servants' stairs and the back passages. If they search the house, they'll find it empty except for family." "What about you?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. "I'll handle the soldiers," Elijah replied with more confidence than he felt. "I'm still a respected businessman in Charleston. My reputation for ruthlessness might actually help us now." As Sarah disappeared to warn the others, Elijah straightened his shoulders and walked toward the front door, mentally preparing to become once again the cold, calculating man he had been before 3 orphaned children taught him how to feel compassion. The Confederate sergeant at his door was young, perhaps 25, with the kind of mustache that suggested he was trying to look older than his years. Behind him stood 3 privates, their rifles held casually, but ready. "Sergeant Morrison," the young man introduced himself with crisp military precision. "We've had reports of unusual activity at this address, large numbers of people coming and going at odd hours, foreign languages being spoken, possible Union sympathies." Elijah let his face settle into the mask of cold indifference that had once come so naturally. "And you believe these reports merit official investigation, Sergeant? Sir, we have reliable information that this house may be harboring individuals of questionable loyalty to the Confederate cause." "Questionable loyalty?" Elijah repeated, allowing ice to creep into his voice. "Are you questioning my loyalty, Sergeant Morrison?" The young soldier shifted uncomfortably. Even in wartime Charleston, Elijah Hartman's reputation for ruthless business practices was well known, and his financial contributions to various Confederate causes had been strategically significant. "No, sir, not your loyalty, but we have reports of foreign persons taking shelter here." "Foreign persons?" Elijah mused, as if considering the phrase. "Sergeant, I assume you're referring to my business associates? I deal with merchants from New York, Philadelphia, even Europe. In wartime, such connections become even more valuable for acquiring necessary supplies for our cause." It was a masterful deflection, built on just enough truth to be believable. Elijah's shipping company did indeed have extensive northern connections, and those connections had been invaluable in moving refugees to safety. "We'd like to search the premises, sir, just to be thorough." This was the moment Elijah had been dreading. Inside the house, 26 people were frantically gathering their few possessions and preparing to disappear through the network of passages that connected to the carriage house and garden shed. But if the soldiers conducted a thorough search— "Of course," Elijah said smoothly. "Though I should warn you, Sergeant, that you'll find the house rather empty at the moment. My nieces and I are preparing for an extended trip to Richmond on business. Most of our household staff have been dismissed temporarily." The explanation for why the house might seem unusually quiet was another calculated risk, but it bought precious time for the refugees to complete their escape. As the soldiers began their search, moving through the mansion's public rooms with professional efficiency, Elijah prayed silently in Hebrew, words that came naturally now after months of rediscovered faith. "Adonai, oz lamo yiten, Adonai yavaresh et amov shalom." The Lord will give strength to his people. The Lord will bless his people with peace. 20 minutes that felt like hours passed before Sergeant Morrison returned to the foyer where Elijah waited with studied calm. "The house appears to be as you described, Mr. Hartman, though I should mention that we found evidence of recent occupancy in several upstairs rooms." Guest quarters, Elijah replied without hesitation. As I mentioned, business associates occasionally require accommodation. The sergeant studied him for a long moment, clearly aware that something wasn't quite right but unable to identify exactly what. Finally, he nodded. We appreciate your cooperation, sir. However, I should inform you that vigilance committees throughout Charleston are being especially watchful for any unusual activities. Perhaps it would be wise to limit your business entertaining during these uncertain times. Sage advice, Sergeant. I'll certainly take it under consideration. After the soldiers departed, Elijah stood alone in his empty foyer, listening to the silence that had replaced the gentle sounds of conversation, children's laughter, and whispered prayers that had filled his home for the past year. The refugees had successfully escaped through the pre-planned routes, but the emptiness felt like a physical ache in his chest. They're all safe, Sarah said softly, appearing from the hidden passage behind the library. Martha guided the last group to the carriage house 10 minutes ago. They'll be at the ship before midnight. And tomorrow? Elijah asked. Tomorrow we start again, Sarah replied, with the quiet determination that never failed to amaze him. Different methods, smaller groups, more careful planning. The work doesn't stop because it gets dangerous. Elijah looked at this remarkable young woman who had somehow become his partner in the most important work of his life. At 17, she possessed courage that would humble most adults, wisdom that came from surviving unimaginable loss, and faith that remained unshakable despite everything she had witnessed of human cruelty. Sarah, he said softly, you know that what we're doing will only get more dangerous from here. The war will make people more suspicious, more frightened, more willing to turn on their neighbors. If we continue this work, Sarah interrupted, we continue to honor the memory of our parents, who taught us that saving one life is like saving the entire world. If we stop this work, then the people who killed our families, who burned the synagogues, who sold us like cattle, they win. She paused, looking around the empty mansion that had been home to so many desperate souls. Besides, she added with a slight smile, we're not just saving other people anymore. Every person we help escape, every family we reunite, every child we keep safe, they're saving us too. They're proving that love is stronger than hatred, that hope is more powerful than fear. As night fell over Charleston and the empty mansion settled into unfamiliar quiet, Elijah and Sarah began planning their next operation. The war had made their work infinitely more dangerous, but it had also made it infinitely more necessary. In the distance, they could hear the sound of marching feet as Confederate patrols moved through the city streets, and closer still, the gentle lapping of harbor waves that would soon carry another group of refugees toward freedom. Have you ever had to choose between personal safety and doing what you knew was right? In times of crisis, what do you think gives ordinary people the courage to become heroes? Share your thoughts below. Charleston, South Carolina, October 1870. The autumn sun cast golden light through the stained glass windows of Congregation Beth Shalom, the first synagogue built in Charleston since before the war, its walls rising like a testament to the power of faith to survive even the darkest chapters of history. Inside, nearly 300 people filled every pew, their faces representing a miracle that few outside these walls could fully comprehend. At the bema stood Elijah ben Abraham, now 55 years old, his hair silver, but his eyes bright with the joy of a man who had found his true purpose. He was no longer the bitter businessman who had once foreclosed on widows, nor the broken soul who had tried to forget his heritage. He was exactly what God had always intended him to be, a protector of his people, a builder of community, a living example of the Jewish teaching that saving one life was like saving the entire world. My friends, he said, his voice carrying easily through the sanctuary, we gather tonight not just to celebrate Shabbat, but to celebrate something more profound, the truth that God's plans for us are often hidden in what appears to be our greatest tragedies. In the front row sat Sarah, now 22 and radiant in her happiness as the wife of David Goldberg, one of the refugees they had saved during the war. Beside her, Rebecca, 21, and a respected teacher at the Jewish school Elijah had established, held her infant son. Miriam, 19 and studying to become a rabbi, one of the first women to pursue such a path, smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her calling in healing the spiritual wounds of trauma survivors. 15 years ago, Elijah continued, I was a man who had lost everything that mattered, my wife, my daughter, and my faith. I believed that God had abandoned me, so I abandoned God. I became exactly the kind of person our people have always feared, someone with power who used it without mercy. His eyes found those of Martha, now free and working as the synagogue's administrator, who had chosen to stay with the family that had become her own. Next to her sat Rabbi Goldberg, the elderly scholar whose burned synagogue in Richmond had led to his arrival at Elijah's mansion so many years ago. But God, in his infinite wisdom, sent me 3 teachers disguised as children who needed rescue. Sarah, Rebecca, and Miriam Goldstein didn't just save me from a life of spiritual emptiness. They taught me that our greatest purpose often emerges from our deepest pain. As he spoke, Elijah's eyes moved across the congregation, seeing faces that told the story of their Underground Railroad success. There was the Rosenberg family, whose baby had been born in his mansion during the war. The young man who had lost his voice to trauma, but found it again through Miriam's patient counseling. The widow whose husband had died protecting their Torah scrolls, now remarried and surrounded by children who would grow up free. During the war, we helped over 400 Jewish souls escape to freedom, Elijah said, his voice growing stronger with emotion. But the truth is, they saved us just as much as we saved them. Each person we helped reminded us who we were meant to be. Each family we reunited taught us about the power of hope. Each child we protected showed us that the future belongs to those who refuse to let hatred win. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, remembering that terrifying day at the slave auction when she had thought her life was over. Now she ran a school for orphaned children, teaching them not just reading and mathematics, but resilience, faith, and the unbreakable truth that every person has infinite worth. The Talmud teaches us, Elijah continued, that we are not required to complete the work of repairing the world, but neither are we free to desist from it. Tonight, as we light these Sabbath candles, we remember that our obligation is not to be perfect, but to be present, not to save everyone, but to save someone. As the familiar melodies of Sabbath prayers filled the sanctuary, many in the congregation remembered other Friday nights, huddled in hidden rooms, whispered prayers in attics and basements, the desperate hope that somehow, somewhere, there were still good people willing to risk everything for strangers. After the service, as the congregation gathered for the community meal that had become a beloved tradition, Sarah approached Elijah with a letter in her hand. "This came today," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "from the Jewish community in Philadelphia." Elijah opened the letter and read silently, his eyebrows rising with surprise. "What is it?" Rebecca asked, joining them with her characteristic curiosity. "They want to establish a memorial," Elijah said slowly. "A permanent record of what we accomplished here. They're calling it the Charleston Sanctuary Project, and they want to document every family we helped, every life we saved." "Will you do it?" Miriam asked, appearing at his elbow with the uncanny timing she had never outgrown. Elijah looked around at the 3 women who had transformed from terrified children into confident leaders, who had somehow managed to teach a broken man how to become whole again. "Only if you help me write it," he said. "This story belongs to all of us." As the evening progressed and families shared meals and stories, Elijah found himself standing once again at a window, looking out at Charleston's streets. But unlike those dark nights 15 years ago when he had stared into emptiness, tonight he saw possibility everywhere. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, joining him as she had so many times before. "About circles," Elijah replied. "About how God takes our broken pieces and arranges them into something beautiful, something whole, something that serves His purposes in ways we never could have imagined." "Do you ever regret it?" Rebecca asked. "Giving up your old life, using your fortune for others instead of keeping it for yourself?" Elijah smiled, the same gentle expression that had replaced his once cruel features. "My dear Rebecca, I didn't give up my fortune. I invested it. And the returns," he gestured toward the room full of thriving families, laughing children and elderly scholars, sharing wisdom with eager students. "The returns have been beyond anything I could have calculated." As the celebration continued late into the night, 4 souls who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances stood together, watching the community they had helped create flourish around them. They had learned that sometimes the greatest treasures are disguised as the greatest burdens, that heroes often begin as broken people who who choose to help others heal, and that God's greatest miracles frequently come wrapped in ordinary moments of extraordinary courage. If this story has touched your heart, please tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Elijah's position? Leave your like, share this with someone who needs to hear that transformation is always possible, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that prove the power of faith, love, and second chances. And tell us, what grade from 0 to 10 would you give this story? We'd love to know your opinion. If you connect with stories of Jewish resilience, wisdom, and the enduring strength of faith through suffering, and you want to learn more from this people who, even in their darkest hours, continue to teach lessons of morality and hope, here is our Jewish Wisdom ebook. If you sense that this teaching resonated with you and you wish to delve deeper, I present to you our ebook, Jewish Wisdom. This material was created based on authentic teachings from the Torah, Talmud, and Kabbalah. These are not personal interpretations, but respected sources that have been studied for generations. In this ebook, you will discover hidden truths that have been preserved for centuries. You will learn why certain practices bring blessings, how to activate spiritual protection over your life and home, and how to connect with the purpose your soul came to fulfill. This is not about dogmas. This is about transformative principles. This is not about religion. This is about awakening. Each chapter was written with the intention of guiding you toward a higher consciousness, a consciousness that does not depend on external things, but springs from the soul. We speak of spiritual cycles, sacred names, hidden codes in the Psalms, the power of words, purification of the soul, and the keys that open doors when everything seems closed. This material is for seekers, people who know there is something more, who feel their soul calling them to awakening. The Jewish Wisdom ebook is available in digital format. You can read it from any country at any time on your phone, tablet, or computer. And if you've made it this far, it's no accident. There is a calling in your life, a divine invitation, because sometimes heaven speaks in silence, and only the attentive soul can hear. The link is in the description. God doesn't waste our pain. He transforms it into purpose, and sometimes the very people we're called to save end up saving us instead.